Kazon, Vidians, and some very tough decisions are just a few of the things to be found in Voyager Across the Unknown. But is this a worthy entry in the Star Trek franchise or a cheap cash-in? Welcome, my name's Azadash and welcome to my review of Across the Unknown. I'll be looking at what works, what doesn't, and ultimately if the game is actually any good. If you exclude the somewhat obscure 1999 arcade game, there has only been one home video game based on the Star Trek Voyager series, that game being Elite Force 1. Now, there have been other games which have featured Voyager as a ship or one of the crew. However, in terms of games based on the Voyager series, Elite Force is all we have had until now. Whereas Elite Force told an independent story based on the Voyager series, Across the Unknown tells a story which is very closely tied to the main plot of the series, alas with a very generous amount of player choice as to just how that plot unfolds, sometimes in unexpected and even tragic ways. Fans of the television series will remember an episode in Season 1 called Faces, where Chief Engineer B'Elanna Torres gets split into two people, one human and one Klingon. Ultimately, in the episode, the Klingon B'Elanna dies and the human one is imprinted with her DNA, saving her life and restoring her to normal. Now, in the game, I wanted to make that same choice to ensure B'Elanna survives, only I had recently been in a combat encounter and my sickbay was damaged and offline, which meant when the choice for restoring B'Elanna to her original self came up, I couldn't actually select the option and had to select Do Nothing instead, to which the next words out of the doctor's mouth were, "I'll make sure Lieutenant Torres passes away as painlessly as possible," followed by an obituary. I'm not going to lie, in that exact moment, the weight of that decision I was forced to make hit me pretty hard, as the outcome was absolutely not the outcome I wanted, but one that I was responsible for and indirectly set in motion long before the pivotal decision. It's also worth pointing out that Across the Unknown has a rather curious save system, as in there is no manual saving whatsoever. The game regularly autosaves after every real decision, and the only way you can return to an earlier point is to restart the entire sector, something which could lose over an hour of gameplay. I think this is going to be a point of contention with some, but honestly, the way the game is narratively driven, I don't really have a problem with it, as it adds enormous weight to any decisions, given there's no real way to redo them. Now, in a separate save file, I actually made a host of different decisions across this mission and was able to save both versions of B'Elanna and gain a new crew member in the process. Credit has to be given here because there is a lot of depth to the game's narrative, and I'm not just talking about major story beats, but virtually all of the narrative is completely customizable, and this is perhaps one of the game's strongest points, that while most people know the Voyager story, you can create your very own version of that story. In terms of if you need to have watched Voyager to enjoy the game, I would say no. Given the way the game presents the story, everything is quite well self-contained. However, having some elementary level of Trek viewership will certainly aid in the overall experience. The game is available on all major platforms, with the PC version being the one shown here for the footage, as well as representing the majority of the time I have spent with the game, although I have also played the game on the Nintendo Switch too, and honestly, for a port to a handheld, it's surprisingly good, and a game that's overall pace suits the pick up and play nature of the Switch well. Before we continue, a massive thank you to those who support the channel. If you enjoy this type of content, please consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. With that out of the way, let's power up the warp core, make sure the sickbay is online, and dive into explore Star Trek Voyager Across the Unknown. There's three core gameplay elements to Across the Unknown: ship management, missions, and combat, and they're all very much linked to one another. For example, you can level up characters on away missions and then assign them to various ship stations as heroes to unlock better stats for ship management. These stats can also extend to combat, making Voyager more effective during it. You can also make decisions on away missions which will require certain crew to leave the ship, either temporarily or permanently, again impacting other parts of the game. Conversely, you can also recruit new crew, which might unlock more favourable, or in some cases unfavourable, outcomes. The bottom line is that despite the game presenting three vastly different interfaces, everything is well connected and is presented as a fairly cohesive overall experience. The majority of the game is spent within the turn-based ship management component of the game. This essentially sees you needing to gradually repair and upgrade Voyager over time to be able to progress the main story. while meeting the growing demands of various resources to enable this, all underpinned by one very important resource, morale. More on this later. The most important resource outside of morale is deuterium. This is basically energy, which is the required resource for powering the warp core, and by extension, virtually every ship function outside of basic movement. There's a central ticker which lists the remaining turns of power available based on the amount of deuterium stored, and this is impacted by what kind and how many ship systems you have built. As you progress through the game, you will unlock the ability to upgrade both your warp core to deliver more power, as well as storage areas to store additional deuterium. Now, I said this is the second most important resource because if you do run out, there can be an avalanche of consequences that won't be able to be solved until you locate a new source of deuterium. The biggest consequence is that many rooms which generate morale will shut down and in some cases apply a negative morale modifier. For example, if the mess loses power, crew need to revert to emergency rations, which sets a morale modifier which will chip away at your total morale until you restore power. I can't stress this enough, but if I look at every early playthrough of mine, which ended in a game over, things went downhill very quickly once I ran out of deuterium, to the extent that in future runs I prioritized building larger storage areas for it and conserving power where possible so not to exhaust it prematurely. There are several other resources such as geranium and tritanium, which are the main resources required to repair, build and upgrade new rooms within Voyager. These rooms are often locked behind research, which is gated using science points and time. There's a tech tree of sorts, and using this you can upgrade anything from crew quarters to the ability to produce new photon torpedoes. There's also going to be times that specific technologies are needed to unlock specific outcomes within missions, meaning that it's often wise to keep a reserve of science points in case this situation comes up. All of the main resources can be accumulated by either successfully completing missions or locating the resource on a planet or other stellar body and then successfully extracting it. The one exception to this is morale, and as I said, this is the most important resource because not only do you have the issue that if it reaches 0 it's game over, but when it falls below a specific threshold, the game applies several debuffs such as repairs taking 20% longer, which in turn will cause you to lose even more. Morale can be obtained by selecting certain choices within missions as well as accomplishing various tasks that will be presented from time to time. But here's the part I don't like. If you accept a random task and fail it, you incur a morale penalty. And if you don't accept it, you also incur a morale penalty, meaning that morale can sometimes be left up to a literal dice roll. Oh, and as you progress through the game, your crew gets homesick, which imposes a statutory morale negative modifier per turn, meaning you need to continue to build and upgrade rooms which provide positive morale. Overall, the ship management is pretty good and gives a genuinely good experience in building your own version of Voyager. I do think that the tech tree could have been improved both in form and function. It takes up far too much screen space, requiring scrolling for what it's actually trying to accomplish, and makes it difficult to understand progression at a glance. Likewise, the science point currency in the early to mid-game just accumulates far too slowly, which in turn results in an underpowered Voyager requiring at times lengthy spells of doing nothing to reach a threshold to progress. The other issue is that when you begin the game, you are locked to 2 work crews, which means you can only be building, repairing or upgrading 2 things at once, or repairing the ship. You do unlock ways to improve this after the mid-game, but the impact in the early game is that you are often spending a lot of time waiting for progression due to these work crews. I honestly think having 3 work crews from the start would have improved quality of life without really impacting the flow of the game. I get the idea with both of these things that the developers may have been concerned about these impacting overall playtime, but honestly, even if this shortened a playthrough by 15 to 20 minutes, the game actively promotes replayability, so I don't think it would have been an issue. As you do progress through the game, you'll encounter various missions, which can be something as simple as helping a freighter in exchange for some deuterium, to far more complex ones such as sending an away mission to a planet to help deal with an asteroid threat. For the basic ones, you get to pick an option as to how to approach it based on risk and what you have unlocked. Land in the green and you get the reward, land in the red and not only do you not get the reward, but you will often be penalized in damage or morale. The more advanced missions typically take place as away missions, and these allow you to choose from a list of available crew, each with various traits which will be helpful in overcoming parts of the mission. Each crew has a particular amount of points in a given trait, which is measured and then dice rolled against the challenge. You can use 2 characters at once if they share the same trait, however for the next challenge they will both be fatigued, meaning their effectiveness is greatly reduced. While I did originally have some flashbacks to Star Trek Timelines, there is actually far more depth to this system than in Timelines, not to mention progression in that game is often paywalled. I really enjoyed the missions in Across the Unknown. I think they are quite well crafted against the backdrop of the Voyager series and offer many different paths which can result in many different outcomes for how the narrative progresses. The last component of the game is the ship-to-ship combat, and I'll get this out of the way early. It is by far the weakest part of the game. It's not terrible, it's objectively better than Timelines, but it is very simple and a victim of other parts of the game offering the player so much agency that when the combat does happen, it feels very linear in comparison to the rest of the game. There's 2 ways to approach combat: participate in combat or allow the game to auto-resolve it based on stats, and honestly, I think the developers realised that this was a weak area of the game and implemented the auto-resolve to avoid player fatigue. Assuming you do choose to participate in it, you can assign several crew to various stations on the ship and use a predefined combat special ability of theirs on a cooldown timer. There is some strategy to this. For example, if someone has an ability that disrupts shields, you might want to use that just before you fire one of your limited photon torpedoes at the enemy. There's also an offense and defense system, which is really just a glorified front end for picking a particular side of the ship to attack or defend. It's hard to critique the combat too much because the reality is that any real meaningful changes or advancements would have required a very substantial uplift to the game, likely measured in the thousands of hours, something which for the price point this game has released at, just would not have been viable. It is very clear that the majority of the developer's energy was spent on the ship management component, and honestly that makes perfect sense. That's the part of the game where you spend 90% of it in, and will likely be the part that shapes your overall experience. Overall, the gameplay is really good, and the only common criticism I have across all of the core loops are pacing and difficulty, and these are both very closely linked to one another. Now, I don't profess to be some type of super gamer. I wouldn't even say I'm a great gamer. I would say that I am okay at most games, and as a result, generally select whichever the medium difficulty is for a game. However, in Across the Unknown, the medium difficulty really feels like the hard difficulty. Not only do you accumulate more negative morale as the game progresses, but you face resource restrictions which in turn slow the pacing down while still having to deal with the looming morale issues. To make this even worse, about 10% of the way into the game, there's a very large skill check in the way of traversing an area with frequent combat ambushes and an environment that damages your ship each turn unless you've researched a specific technology. Now, my criticism here could just be a case of me needing to be a better gamer, but after reading similar feedback online, I'm not convinced I'm the only one that feels this way. Oh, and one last thing. From a pacing perspective, having to play through the tutorial every time you start a new playthrough is a bit of a pain, and I'm hopeful that a patch can be released in the near future to address this, especially as the game invites multiple playthroughs. As far as presentation goes, Across the Unknown is a mostly competent title. Visually, most of the time the game looks really good. Voyager itself looks great in and out of cutscenes, characters all use their series likeness, and the control interface is crisp and mostly well laid out. Combat, despite it being fairly basic, also looks good and fits in well to the game's overall art style. What doesn't fit in is some of the pictures displayed during the mission progression screens. It's not that some are bad per se, but that the art style seems to rotate between 3 different styles, almost as if they were done by 3 completely separate people. It doesn't impact the gameplay experience in any way, but it does detract from the overall presentation, and I do wonder if the developers had more time, if this would have been something they would have put more focus into. In terms of the overall performance and stability, on fairly modest hardware, the game has been rock solid since the moment I started playing it, with smooth frame rates and no crashes of any description. Control on PC is handled by a mixture of mouse and keyboard, and it's a fairly effortless affair. On the Switch, control is also really good. There are some quite intelligent decisions made around button mapping, which feel very intuitive, and while not all games of this style translate well to a controller, I'd say this one has no issues. Sound design is a tricky topic to discuss, and for the most part, an exercise in expectation management. The game features very limited voice acting, with the majority of the adventure being text-based, with some limited voice features from Tim Russ and Robert Duncan McNeil.
So, a few days back, this Captain Janeway breezes into my cozy penal colony like she owns the place. She's stern and smells like coffee and regulations. And the kicker? She's served with my old man on the Albatani. Turns out her security chief, Tuvok, was playing spy on a Maquis ship that vanished in the Badlands.
The crew's persistent capacity for adaptation under the sustained pressure of the Kazon Nistrum threat is exemplary. This unexpected resilience offers crucial protection against the ongoing threat.
These features are quite good and do give the game a bit of an authenticity bump. In terms of the absence of complete voice acting, I think we need to be realistic here. Do we want a $30 game without voice acting or a $60 game with voice acting? Because I can tell you that assembling the cast required would add substantial cost to the game and reduce its overall accessibility. Personally, I would prefer the $30 version with no voice acting, but your own opinion on this topic may of course vary. The part of the sound design I can't justify though are the sound effects, namely the fact that many of them just don't sound anything like the series. Take a listen to this clip from a Kazon ship firing at Voyager. Now, if you've seen any amount of Voyager, you will know that this just doesn't sound anything like Kazon weapons fire. I don't understand how, as part of the license acquisition, the developers were not able to gain access to or even legitimately rip the sound effects from the source material, but it really stands out in an otherwise fairly good audio experience. When a game is created based on an existing IP, it's often a case of risk versus reward, the risk being appeasing fans of the IP, while the reward is having access to a very large established market. Along with this often comes high expectations. Based on the series' success, the game should also be successful. In the case of Across the Unknown, it's not a perfect game. There are some ideas which don't work as well as others, and some decisions which seem unusual to say the least. But for the most part, the game is a thoroughly enjoyable adventure that offers more player choice than has perhaps ever featured in a Star Trek game, all while sticking to the core concepts which made the series successful. In terms of overall value, the game's roguelike nature lends itself to many playthroughs, and it's a game that I can see myself playing for a very long time as I continue to explore all of the various story avenues. There's also a DLC available which includes several new characters and missions, and I'm hopeful that there will be more DLC in the future because the foundation for DLC Edition is quite strong. I do also wonder theoretically if the developers were to make a sequel, which series they would choose. TNG seems like an obvious choice given the sheer volume of stories to be told, but I'd also be curious to see how the original series or even Enterprise could look like, or perhaps a brand new IP. I don't know, I just know that the gameplay loop has more mileage than a single title. But that's enough from me. Do you agree or disagree with my opinions? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.